Good morning. Let's talk a little bit about the nervous system today. Chapter 11, the last part of exam number 3 materials. This is an overview of the nervous system. We'll talk about nervous tissue. We will spend the rest of the semester talking about the various and sundry nervous systems. So the nervous system controls perception and experience of the world. It's how we determine it's hot, it's cold, it hurts, it doesn't hurt, it's pleasurable, whatever. Directs voluntary movement. It is through the nerves that we're able to pick things up, walk across the room. I'm able to operate this clicker. It's the seat of consciousness, personality, learning, and memory. Regulates many aspects of homeostasis with the endocrine system, such as your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, your body temperature, your sleep-wake cycle, and your blood pH. All of those things that you see here are under the control of the nervous system. The nervous system is divided anatomically into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The brain has billions of nerve cells, which are called neurons. We talked about them a little bit earlier in the semester when we talked about tissues back in around chapter 4 or 5. This area is protected by the bones of the skull, the brain, that is. The spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum. Again, when we looked at the bones, that large hole at the base of the skull. The word foramen magnum, literally translated from Latin, means big hole. It continues through the vertebral foramina. That's the hole through all of those vertebrae that you looked at in lab and that we talked about in here. Of the first cervical vertebra into the first and second lumbar vertebra. You have millions of neurons, but fewer than the brain. And this spinal cord enables the brain to communicate with most of the body below the head and neck. The nerves, which we'll talk about in a subsequent chapter, that control most of the things from here up, originate from the brain. From here down, almost everything originates from the spinal cord. When we talk about those things called the cranial nerves, we will talk about one or two of those that do venture below the neck. But for the most part, if it's from your neck up, the nerves originate from the brain. If it's from the neck down, those nerves originate from the spinal cord. The other part of the nervous system is the peripheral. Did I skip one? Yes, I did. I'm sorry. No, there we go. Peripheral nervous system. I'm sorry. The peripheral nervous system is all the nerves in the body outside the protection of the skull and the vertebral column. These are the things we normally think of when we talk about nerves. You know, you bang your elbow and you go, oh, wow, I hit my funny bone. That's really not a bone that you've hit. It's the ulnar nerve that you've actually hit. That is an example of a part of the peripheral nervous system. The nerves have axons on those neurons, which are bundled together with blood vessels and connective tissues that carry the signal to and from the central nervous system, classified by their origin and their destination. The cranial nerves, we will talk about those. There's 12 pairs of those that lead that travel to and from the brain. Spinal nerves, there's one pair of nerves traveling to and from the spinal cord. Those are the spinal nerves, and we'll talk about those as well. So here is an overview of the entire nervous system. Here's the brain and the spinal cord going down the middle. That is the central nervous system. Think of things in the center. Things that are on the periphery. The word periphery literally means on the edge. So peripheral nervous system, these are going to be the things out here on the edges. So you've got the cranial nerves that go into areas like the face and some other places. And then you've got the spinal nerves, which are the ones that go all down our legs and down our hands, etc. The functional divisions, the nervous system is divided into sensory, integrative, and motor. Sensory nerves are the afferent nervous system. They gather information about external and internal environments. They collect that input from both subdivisions, which we'll talk about below. They carry receptors to the spinal cord and or the brain by the spinal and cranial nerves. You have the somatic sensory system, carries signals from the skeletal muscles, the bones, the joints, and the skin, also from the organs of vision, hearing, taste, smell, and balance. So the somatic system is our skeletal muscles, and then the organs of vision, hearing, taste, smell, and balance. The visceral sensory division, think of that term we used early, the viscera. Viscera refers to basically the organs within the trunk. So you've got your heart, your lung, the stomach, kidneys, urinary bladder. In addition, all of those associated structures with the stomach, the small and large intestine, and those kinds of things. The integrative functions, integrative means to integrate or to bring together. These analyze and interpret incoming sensory information, determine an appropriate response. 99% of the integrated sensory information is subconsciously disregarded as unimportant. So 99% of sensory input. When we're looking around and we're looking at a room, we're watching a football game, we are only concentrating on about 1% of the things we are watching. If you're watching a football game from the stands, you can see the bleachers on the other side. You can see the bench on the other side. You can see the bench on your side if you're high enough up. You can see things in your peripheral vision off to the side. But what are you concentrating on? What's going on the field? Somebody could be committing a murder over there, and you won't see it and you won't register it because your brain is telling you that all that stuff over there is unimportant. Something has to happen over there to get your attention for you to change your gaze from the play on the field to what's going on in the bleachers on the other side. Even though when you're looking this way, you can see it, but your brain's not paying attention to it. The remaining sensory stimuli that the central nervous system does respond to leads to motor response. So you're watching the game, you're clapping, you're going, oh man, why didn't you throw the ball? Or throw the ball, or fumble. Or, if you're watching a baseball game, how in the world could you not feel that ground ball? Come on, first baseman. You're watching there, you're not watching what's around you. Motor functions are actions performed in response to the integrations by the motor or the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. It's divided into somatic and autonomic divisions by the organs that the neurons contact. Motor neurons carry out motor functions, travel from the brain and spinal cord via cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The effectors are organs that carry out the effects of the nervous system. And we're going to talk about the subdivisions on the next slide. So the brain senses something, sends a signal to the motor or efferent division, and then the motor neurons decide what needs to be done. The effectors come to the same conclusion. And then we have two different motor divisions. There's the somatic motor division, which transmits signals to skeletal muscle. These are under voluntary control. This is also sometimes called the voluntary motor division. You see something coming and you dodge. That is a motor reaction. An autonomic reaction of the autonomic nervous system, or visceral motor division, or visceral motor division. These neurons carry out signals to the thoracic and abdominal viscera. They're critical for maintaining homeostasis. They regulate secretions from glands. They contract smooth muscle. The contraction in cardiac muscle. These are involuntary, the involuntary motor division. If something truly exciting is happening, you get that signal and your heart rate may speed up. As you start to relax, then your heart rate goes back down. Functions, here we go. We've got our sensory input. This young lady sees the soccer ball coming toward her, and the brain is going to decide, what am I going to do with it? The integration, the brain says, okay, we're going to kick the ball. So we send the integration through the spinal cord. Then the motor output says, let's kick the ball, and she kicks the ball back toward her goal or away from her goal if she's a defenseman or whatever. So we have the central nervous system here. Signals, there's the peripheral nervous system, but the signal goes to the motor or the efferent division, either skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. It is then interpreted, by the somatic or visceral, and then the proper reaction happens. Okay, nervous tissue. We talked about this a little bit a couple of 3 weeks ago when we talked about tissues. We're going to go into a little bit more depth here. But neurons are the excitable cells. These are the ones that are responsible for sending and receiving signals, such as action potential. Remember when we talked about action potential a couple of lectures ago? Most neurons consist of 3 parts. You have a cell body, which is the most actively or most metabolically active region. This manufactures the proteins needed for the whole neuron. Organelles support a high level of biosynthetic activity, contains both ribosomes and a rough endoplasmic reticulum for protein synthesis. And the rough endoplasmic reticulum is visible microscopically in structures which we call Nissl bodies. There is a Golgi apparatus, which is there for vesicular transport of these proteins. Large and or multiple nuclei containing ribosomal RNA, and mitochondria, which supply energy that is required for these cells to function. This cell will also have cytoskeleton, which are microtubules, which are there for structural support, but they're also there to support those chemicals needed for nerve cells to work. Those things we call neurotransmitters. They travel through a series of cytoskeletal elements. And finally, the neurofibrils are the last part of the cell body. They are intermediate filaments of the cytoskeleton. They support the structure and extending into the neuron processes, which we will talk about in just a moment. The next structure that all neurons are going to have are dendrites. These are short branched processes. They receive input from the neurons, which they transmit toward the cell body as electrical impulses. Each neuron may have multiple dendrites, but each neuron only has one axon. So you may have multiple dendrites, only one axon. The axon is the part of the cell that can actually generate and conduct action potentials, and there are several distinct regions of the axon. The place where the axon originates from the cell body is referred to as the axon hillock. The branches extending from the main axon are called axon collaterals. So a main branch will come out, that's the axon, and then it may form branches. Here's the axon, and it may form branches like my fingers, which would be the axon collaterals. Telodendria are small branches arising from the axon and axon collaterals near the end of the extensions, and axon terminals or synaptic bulbs arise from the telodendria, the components that communicate with the target cells. If you'll remember on the muscle tissue when we were talking about the axon terminal and the neuromuscular junction, there was that little rounded bulb-like structure at the end of the axon. That is a axon terminal or synaptic bulb. And the axolemma is the plasma membrane that surrounds the axon and its cytoplasm. And again, in the axon, that cytoplasm has its own name. It's referred to as the axoplasm. Substances travel through the axoplasm by 2 types of axonal transport. You have slow transport, which transports the substances via cytoskeletal proteins from cell body to axon, the rate of 1 to 3 millimeters per day. And the fast terminals or the fast transport, which requires motor proteins and consumes ATP. These vesicles have membrane-bound organelles that travel back toward or away from the cell body. Movement toward is called retrograde. Movement away is anterograde. And these move at a maximum of 200 millimeters per day or 400 millimeters per day, respectively. So they move to or retrograde at this rate, anterograde at the 400. And there is a picture of neuron or tissue. Looks like it's magnified using a light microscope 220 times. This is a neuron. This component right here is the cell body. The nuclei, which do not show very well on these slides. The extracellular matrix is all this component in here. The little dots are the neuroglial cells, which we'll talk about glial cells in a minute. This particular slide does not really differentiate between which ones of these components are axons and which ones are dendrites. And as far as the axon terminals and all, that doesn't show. You have to magnify much higher magnification to get that type of distinction. Here is a drawing showing the cell body here. Here's the nucleus. See the multiple. There's the Golgi apparatus. There's the rough endoplasmic reticulum. There are the mitochondria. This whole thing is the cell body. These little structures coming off here, these are dendrites. Here is the axon coming off. There's the axon collateral. You'll notice the axons are myelinated. They have what is called a myelin sheath that acts very similar to the insulation wiring on an electrical cord. If there wasn't that electrical wiring, every time you touched a cord that was plugged into the wall, you'd get electrocuted. So you have that covering. That's the insulator. That's what the role the myelin sheath plays. When we talk about development in A&P2, we'll talk about how the nervous system of babies is not fully myelinated. So this structure, the myelin sheath, is not formed correctly. That's why the babies have sometimes delayed reactions to things. There's a thing that they do for babies where they rub the bottom of their feet and their toes go a direction. It's called Babinski sign. And the natural, what most people do when you rub the bottom of their feet, your toes go one way, but you know, a 2 or 3 week old baby, their toes do something different. Polio and retrograde axonal transport. Poliomyelitis is caused by poliovirus. It is an infection, impacts the central nervous system, especially the spinal cord, can result in deformity or paralysis. Polio was something that was a big problem in the early 1900s. President Roosevelt suffered from polio. In later years of his life, he was wheelchair bound because he could no longer use his legs from the effects of the polio he had as a young child. No cure for polio exists. However, it can be easily treated and prevented by a vaccine. Not treated, excuse me, prevented by a vaccine. That's one of the childhood vaccines that there's been so much controversy about over the last few years. But polio is one that is prevented by those vaccines. Virus assesses the central nervous system by first entering muscle cells, passes into the motor neurons at the neuromuscular junction, travels the length of the axon by retrograde axonal transport until it reaches the spinal cord. Other viruses that play a role in the nervous system, the herpes simplex viruses, rabies, certain toxins such as tetanus also have the ability to enter the nervous system through this same pathway. There's a picture of a neuron. 3 major functional regions. You have the receptive region, that's the dendrites and the cell body. You have the conducting region, and then you have the secretory of the axon terminal. So here's the receptive region here. You have then the conducting region of the axon, and then the secretory region. Each one of these little bulbs is where the axon terminal and the synaptic bulb is. That's where the neurotransmitters will be released. And each one of these little bulbs will be attached either to an effector organ, like a muscle or some other structure, or attached to another nerve cell dendrite. So this could be attached to a muscle down here. It could be attached to your gallbladder. It could be attached to your urinary bladder, or it could be attached to another nerve cell. Neurons have come in several varieties. The same single axon type with multiple dendrites accounts for about 99% of the neurons. These are called multipolar neurons because they have multiple dendrites. Bipolar neurons have one axon and one dendrite, and the cell body between them. Eye, olfactory epithelium, the ones in the nasal cavity. So the things that give us vision or play a role in vision and play a role in smell are the bipolar neurons. And the pseudo unipolar neuron only has one fused axon. That axon extends from the cell body. It divides into two processes. One carries sensory information from these receptors. The other carries sensory information from the cell body to the spinal cord. You'll notice these pseudo unipolar do not have any dendrites. Neurons can be classified in three functional groups. Now this is three types, structural groups, and then here are functional groups. You have the sensory or afferent neurons carry information toward the central nervous system. They have cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system from the sensory receptors. They relay information via axons to the brain or spinal cord. These are usually pseudo-unipolar or bipolar. Interneurons or association neurons, these are the ones that relay information within the central nervous system between sensory and motor neurons. Most neurons in the body, such as the multipolar, or these are multipolar, communicate with many other neurons. And the motor or efferent neurons carry information away from the cell body in the central nervous system to the muscles and glands, and these are mostly multipolar. So there we have the different types. These are our motor neurons, multipolar neurons. You see one axon coming off each one, but multiple dendrites coming off. Here is the bipolar. You have one axon and one dendrite. And then here you have the pseudo-unipolar. Here's the cell body. This is the axon. You have the peripheral axon and the central axon going to the peripheral nerves, going to the central nervous system. See the typical functional classes: motor, sensory, afferent, and then you have the location where they will be found. Specific neuron groups or neuron components in the central nervous system. You have clustered nuclei found within the neuron cell bodies, and you have bundles of axons. In the peripheral nervous, you have things called ganglia, which we will talk about in a little while, and what we call our nerves, which are large bundles of axons. The neuroglial cells, these are, again, those cells I pointed out when we saw the slide of the nervous tissue. These are the cells that provide structural support and protection. They also help maintain the environment. These are the cells that are still mitotic. The neuroglial cells replicate and reproduce. The neurons generally don't reproduce, and if they do, they don't reproduce very often. But again, these are able to divide and fill the space left between or behind when a neuron dies. They form of each type of neuroglial cell is specialized for its function. Again, that's the structure and function core principle. They're made to do a job, and they can do a job because of the way they're made. There's actually 6 types of neuroglial cells, sometimes called neuroglia, sometimes simply referred to as glial cells. 4 types are found in the central nervous system. That's the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes, the microglia, and the epidermal cells. 2 types are found in the peripheral nervous system, the Schwann cells and satellite cells. The astrocytes are large star-shaped cells. They have many processes terminating in structures called end feet. Their function are to anchor the neurons in place and blood vessels in place and help define and maintain 3-dimensional structures in the brain. Again, this is the cell we were talking about. They transport nutrients and gases between blood vessels And neurons, they regulate extracellular environment of the brain. They form what is called the blood-brain barrier. It is a protective structure, surrounds capillary endothelial cells, makes them impenetrable to most polar compounds and proteins, and they play a role in repairing damaged brain tissue by rapid cell division. So those are the astrocytes. The oligodendrocytes are these, also in the central nervous system. They radiate processes with flattened sacs. You see the little flattened sacs on the end. They wrap around axons and nearby neurons to form the myelin. So there's the wrapping around to form the myelin sheath on those structures. So it's the cells in blue. So you have the astrocytes in yellow, the oligodendrocytes in blue. The microglia, these are the little red ones we see here. So here's still the astrocytes. The second one we discussed, the oligodendrocytes, and then the microglia. These are small. They're not very numerous. They're activated by injury into wandering phagocytic cells within the central nervous system. They ingest disease-causing microorganisms, dead neurons, and unicellular debris. So the microglial cells are basically the cleaning crew in the central nervous system. So the astrocytes supply oxygen, nutrients, and those sorts of things and help hold everything in place. These form the myelin sheath, which insulates the axon, and these guys collect the waste. And finally, the epidermal cells are ciliated cells. They line hollow spaces within the central nervous system. They manufacture and circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So here they are. There's all the other components, and here are the cells of the epidermal cell. They get their name epidermal because they sort of they look like the epidermal layers of the cell. And there's the whole congregation. There's the astrocytes, again, anchoring everything in place, helping with giving energy to all these things. There's the oligodendrocytes forming the myelin sheath. There's the microglial cells doing their job of, collecting used up things and playing waste remover. And then here are the cells making and secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. The glial cells of the peripheral nervous system, there's only two of them. There's the Schwann cells. These encircle the axons and provide them with myelination. And the satellite cells surround the cells of the neurons in the peripheral nervous system, provided supporting functions. And there they are. There's the Schwann cells forming the myelin sheath. There's the satellite cells anchoring and supporting the cell body. The myelin sheath, I'm going to stop right here and we'll pick up with the myelin sheath a little bit later.